All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're going to tackle a huge idea about our own minds, maybe one you've never even questioned. Where do our deepest, most private fantasies actually come from? Are they just there, or is something else going on? So let's start with this big question. Are our fantasies already fully formed, buried deep inside of us like some kind of lost treasure, just waiting for us to dig them up? It's a really compelling idea. But what if it's completely backwards? For the longest time, the go-to way of thinking about the unconscious mind has been this kind of archaeological model. The idea is that all our experiences and fantasies just settle down inside us, layer by layer, like sediment. And so the job of psychoanalysis is to be an archaeologist, to dig down, find these ancient artifacts, and bring them into the light. And you can see this idea perfectly in this quote from Josef Breuer, who is Freud's mentor, really. He's talking about his patient Anna O, and he says he's relieving her of the whole stock of imaginative products that she had accumulated. I mean, listen to that language. A stock. Something that's accumulated. It's like fantasies are just stuff that piles up and needs to be cleaned out. Okay, but here's where it starts to get really interesting. Because this simple, tidy idea of digging things up, it actually creates a huge puzzle. A contradiction that sits right at the very heart of Freud's own work. The thing is, Freud kind of left us with two big ideas that just don't seem to fit together at all. On the one hand, he gave us a very specific description of the unconscious, and on the other, he talked about these super detailed, elaborate fantasies that are supposedly living there. Let's just look at this side by side. So on the left, you've got Freud's unconscious system. It's chaos. Pure chaos. It's run by what he calls the primary process, which means there's no time, no logic, no cause and effect. It's just raw data, these thing presentations. But then on the right, you have a fantasy. A fantasy is a story. It's got characters, a plot, a beginning, middle, and end. It's highly organized. So you see the problem, right? Let me put it another way. How can you have a perfectly constructed house with walls and a roof and plumbing in a place that has no architect, no blueprints, and not even any laws of physics? How do you get this beautiful, organized structure to emerge from absolute, total chaos? That's the contradiction. So how do we solve this? Well, this is where the psychoanalyst Dominique Scarfone comes in with a really brilliant way out of this mess. He basically says we need to completely shift how we think about this. It's not about a place, it's about a process. What Scarfone suggests is that for 100 years, we've been asking the wrong question. We keep asking what's in the unconscious, as if it's a big storage container. Scarfone says no. The right question is, what does the unconscious do? How does it work? And this leads us to his core idea, fantasy building. The key is to stop thinking of a fantasy as a thing you find and start seeing it as a process. It's like a mental assembly line that takes these raw, chaotic little seeds from the unconscious and builds them into something structured, a full fantasy that we can actually talk about and think about. So how does this assembly line work? Well, it happens in about 4 steps. First, you've got the seed. These are those raw bits in the unconscious, the thing presentations. Then comes the link. These little seeds start to get connected to words, to language, and that starts to give them some shape. That leads to the draft, which is this kind of rough, imaginative sketch that happens in the preconscious mind. And then finally, you get the fantasy, the finished product, an organized structure, a story that can now pop into your conscious mind. So the main takeaway here, the absolute game changer, is this. Fantasies aren't found deep in some mental archaeological dig. They are actively, dynamically built by your mind. Okay, that's a pretty huge claim, right? But does this model actually hold up? Well, let's put it to the test. Let's see if this idea of fantasy building can help us understand some other classic psychoanalytic ideas a little better. So let's take the concept of après-coup, or what's called deferred action. This is the wild idea that our past isn't set in stone. Something that happens to you today can actually loop back in time and give a totally new meaning to something that happened when you were a kid. You see, you're not just retrieving an old memory. You're actively rewriting it based on your present. That's building, not finding. But hey, the real acid test is whether this works on Freud's own stuff. So let's take one of his most famous and complex case studies, the one about the fantasy a child is being beaten. Now, Freud laid out 3 stages to this fantasy, but it was that middle stage that was always really mysterious and weird. And get this. This is the smoking gun. When Freud talks about that mysterious middle phase, the one that's supposed to be deep in the unconscious, he himself writes that, quote, "We may say of it in a certain sense that it has never had a real existence." And then he drops this bombshell. It is a construction of analysis. Let that sink in for a second. The founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, is basically telling us, yeah, that key piece of the fantasy, I didn't find it, we built it. It was constructed right there, in the therapy room, by linking all those unconscious bits and pieces to language and creating a coherent story for the very first time. So, what does this all mean? Why does shifting from a model of finding to a model of building change absolutely everything? Well, it completely reframes how we relate to our own minds and even our own past. So let's just recap the big shift. We're going from finding fantasies to building them. We're going from seeing the mind as a static archive to seeing it as a dynamic, ongoing process. We stop worrying so much about unconscious content and start getting fascinated by the unconscious process. And it means our past isn't some fixed movie that we just replay. It's more like a living script that we are constantly editing. When you put it all together, this model totally recasts our inner world. It's not some dusty old museum full of artifacts behind glass that we're afraid to touch. No, it's a living, breathing, noisy, messy workshop where we are the ones hammering and sawing, constantly building and rebuilding the stories that make us who we are. And that really leaves us with one final big thought. If our deepest, most important fantasies are things that we build, not things that we just find, well, what does that say about who we think we are? And maybe even more exciting, what does that say about who we can still decide to become?